Hi, everyone. With us in this session, we have Sangeet Choudary, who is a very esteemed platform expert. In fact, it was the work of Sangeet in his two books, Platform Revolution and Platform Scale, that I used previously to build a sort of billion-dollar platform. It's with great pleasure that we're now working together. Whereas we've used some of Sangeet's work to disrupt with platforms, and we're now working together to disrupt platforms themselves. So, Sangeet, welcome.
Thank you, Justin. Fabulous to be here and looking forward to this discussion.
Brilliant. So as I mentioned, I previously used a lot of the learnings from your prior work to build Web2 platforms, and now we're working together and looking at Web3. So
right.
platforms and network effects underlie both Web2 and Web3. But I think a lot of the knowledge in Web2 and Web3 has sort of hitherto been quite separate and distinct. So what do you think are the sort of crucial differences and similarities then?
Yeah, I think it's helpful if we think about what took us to Web 2, and how we're moving from Web 2 to Web 3. So if you think about the dominant business model that existed before Web 2, the dominant business model from the industrial era that then got appropriated into software and eventually into Web 1, was fundamentally a production business model where the role of the company was to centralize production, to centralize company building, to centralize governance, and to in a way centralize funding as well. So it was very much built around building products, shipping it to market, capturing value, and everything being managed by one single company. So that's where the vertically integrated corporation came up, and that's what I think of as a pipeline model, where you push value in a certain direction and the consumer just consumes and pays you for it. What happened with Web 2 was that these four variables, production, company building, ecosystem, governance, and funding, one of these variables shifted a bit. Production became decentralized. So production could now be done by the ecosystem. It could be done by third parties. It could be done by partners. And that's where platforms started coming in. And the reason production became decentralized was because we now had connected infrastructure. We had mobile connectivity. We had cloud-based application hosting, and we had the ability to use data at scale. So we could manage production across an entire ecosystem. And so that's where the Web 2 platform model came up, which was really a very convenient model because even though it started with the notion of removing the gatekeepers and making the intermediaries more efficient, eventually what it morphed into was a convenient model where it radiated risks to the ecosystem and centralized the returns towards itself. So there are many examples of how this works out. If you think of how Amazon works, the smaller sellers and the brands take the risk. Amazon as the marketplace knows from the data which brands are taking off and which ones align with its sourcing and goals as a retailer, and is able to proactively enter those categories and outcompete those brands. So essentially the risks have been taken by the ecosystem, the returns have been centralized by the platform. This is also seen in companies like Uber, where you have players above the algorithm who are coding the platform and players below the algorithm who are driving the cars, and the returns are very different in the two cases. And so what we've kind of seen with Web 2 has been a very interesting expansion on the production side, which led to network effects where more producers coming in from outside attracted more consumers. And so that's where the network effects of Web 2 came in. What's fundamentally different about Web 3 is that where Web 2 was about decentralizing production, but continued to centralize governance, venture building, funding, all of it being funded by venture capital and being managed by a single company, Web 3 holds the promise of potentially decentralizing all of these. Decentralizing production, which already has been decentralized with Web 2, but beyond that, decentralizing venture building, the components of the marketplace no longer need to be built by a single company like Amazon. It can be built by a range of different actors who are participating in different um, capacities. So venture building can be decentralized. Governance can be decentralized because now there are new forms of governance that can be embedded into the usage of the token. And finally, funding with the token model can be decentralized. So by decentralizing all of these four variables, Web3 has the potential to fundamentally re-architect how network effects work. We no longer have network effects just in production, but we have network effects in venture building. The more stakeholders build around the protocol, the more value accrues to the token, and that in turn attracts even more stakeholders to build around the protocol. We have network effects in governance, again, enabled through this token model. And then we have network effects in funding. And so that's what's really interesting about Web 2 versus Web 3. Now, I do believe that decentralization versus centralization is not binary. We're going to make choices somewhere in between. So there will be some elements of centralization we take over to Web3 as we try to solve for scalability and other issues. But it provides the mechanisms to decentralize across all of these four variables, and that's what is fundamentally different about Web3 versus Web2 when it comes to network effects.
Yeah, and I know we've had hours and hours of sort of fascinating conversations on this, and that I guess prior to our conversations, I saw sort of Web 2 as one thing and Web 3 as another. Now, it feels like a progressive decentralization, as you said. With Web 2, we decentralized production costs, but kept a lot of the other factors centralized, which led to these kind of like market failures, if you like. And now
Right.
with Web 3, we're looking to further decentralize to kind of protect us, collectively against some of those sort of those market failures. So it's fascinating. And so why do you think, these, I guess what the overall architecture of Web 2 and Web 3, what are the main sort of differences, and why do you think it matters?
I think the fundamental difference between Web 2 and Web 3, um, and to understand this difference, we have to take a step back and think about what drives ecosystem participation in markets. What really drives participation is incentives. And in Web 2, incentive design was about offering subsidies. It was about managing the demand curve so that you would offer subsidies to one side, and that would in turn create enough value on the platform to attract the other side. So it was a lot about offering these intelligent subsidies. What I believe happens with Web3 is that we can code, or we can encode a lot of these subsidies into the token model, into how the token works. And in some way, the token is not just enabling you and providing you ownership. I think what was different about Web 2 was that the owners were very different from the other stakeholders, and the value accrued to the owners. And with Web 3, anybody who's creating value can participate as an owner. So the gap between um, centralized capital and ecosystem labor, if you will, is getting more blurred if we think of the token as a mechanism to manage all of that. But what happens with Web3 is that you can bake in all of these incentives, whether it's incentives for venture building, incentives for governance, incentives for production. All of these incentives get baked into the design of the token. So in some way, the token kind of substitutes a lot of things that used to happen in Web 2, whether employees were being incentivized by stock grants, users were being incentivized by discount coupons. All of those incentives get managed centrally with the token. Now, because of this, what ends up happening is that we have mutually reinforcing effects between the rise of token value and the strengthening of network effects. The more the venture building happens around the protocol, the more the token value appreciates. That in turn attracts even more venture builders. And the same thing you could apply to production. You could apply the same thing to governance. The better a token is governed, the more incentives for production and for venture building around it. And that in turn increases token value, which accrues back to those who are staking that towards governance. So there's because we've now decentralized all of those four layers and not just production, we now have the benefit of network effects across production, venture building, governance, and funding, all managed through the token value. Now, the reason this is important is because in Web 2, when you think about platforms in Web 2, there were two forms of competition. There was competition between ecosystems. So there would be Android competing with Apple's ecosystem. But then there was competition within ecosystems. This was Amazon competing with brands in its own ecosystem, Google competing with, yeah, Samsung and other handset manufacturers in its own ecosystem. And what the token model does is it, in some way, if a token is designed correctly, is designed in the right way, it removes, or it dramatically reduces competition within the ecosystem, because all stakeholders within the ecosystem are incentivized to work towards accruing more value in the token. And with reducing competition within the ecosystem, there's a lot more value that gets created and shared across the ecosystem. So there is a caveat with everything that I'm saying over here. It all goes back to how well you design the token model and how well that then feeds back into governance, into network effects, etc. But this shift of removing competition within the ecosystem is a massive one, because if you look at Web 2, one of the biggest issues was this conflict of interest between the platform and the stakeholders. Google owns Google Maps, and hence it controls LG and Samsung. Amazon owns the marketplace, so it controls what brands can get access to the buy box. So a lot of those factors get eliminated, and the intra-ecosystem competition goes away in Web 3 if the token is designed well. Again, that's the caveat. If the token is not designed well, the intra-ecosystem competition can actually kill the ecosystem in itself.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think I mean one of the things that drew me into Web3 was this token just gives you a whole new toolkit for solving problems like, classic problems of platforms, of this sort of bootstrapping problem, and a token is a superpower for incentivizing participants early before there's utility in the network, for example. And then I totally agree as well that whereas in Web 2 you've got these two sort of cohorts, one is participating and another is accruing the value. Mm-hmm. Now they are sort of one and the same, and these are like fundamental. And so what would you say in terms of sort of specifically adoption? How do you what do you think the major, and I know that this is one of the main pieces of work that we're doing in terms of looking at how do we go to market, enable adoption, combining kind of strategies from Web 2 and Web 3. But
right.
What do you think the considerations of adoption are, and how do they change between Web 2 and Web 3?
Yeah, I think one of the key considerations of adoption that's different about Web 3 versus Web 2 is you're kind of managing or balancing venture building and platform usage at the same time, because what you're providing out there is the protocol. You have to build out other components. Venture building is probably not even the right term over here, because the venture itself is decentralized. But really building the components that will be used to facilitate exchange. That, along with facilitating exchange, you have to kind of manage these two things in parallel. So roadmap design becomes much more important, because in Web 2, a lot of this roadmap design was just internal PRD, product requirements, etc. In Web 3, you're kind of incentivizing external stakeholders, external developers to build out a lot of this roadmap, and at the same time, ensuring that the market that needs to use this and hence create value back for these developers also comes in sync with this roadmap development. So even when we think about the work that we've been doing, some of the considerations around road mapping have been just about how do you ensure that the roadmap for developer participation and the roadmap for user participation works exactly in sync, and how do you de-risk both those roadmaps as you move forward. So if we think about decentralized commerce. Commerce, for example, is a very broad category. We're talking about highly trusted transactions, say transactions with brands at one end, to highly variable and uncertain transactions, say peer-to-peer transactions around items whose value is not certain at the other end. So when we move from one end where we have trust and standardization to the other end where we have uncertainty and variability, we need to have a roadmap. And that's what we've been really working on over here. We need to have a roadmap that phases this out gradually and that solves for core component creation initially, transactions around those core components, and gradually increases the complexity of the transaction and hence the ecosystem of components that need to support the protocol as we move down the roadmap. So I think that's the key difference between Web 2 versus Web 3. In Web 2, given sufficient funding, given sufficient talent hiring, you can get to building whatever level of complexity you need right up front, assuming you have product market fit. But here it's beyond product market fit. It's equally venture market fit, and it's equally product venture fit, and so on. So um, that's I think is the real difference between Web 2 and Web 3, balancing these two things in sync.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the end game for Boson Protocol is, a core protocol with a number of components, all that are going to work together to enable this full decentralized commerce. As you quite rightly say, the complex or end is peer to peer with untrusting peers, and that's why we've started at, I guess, the easier end, which is with more brands that you can trust, and then over time we're building and slotting in those components that will then support a more sort of trustless commerce. Excellent.
Right.
And so obviously one of the big differences in Web3 is this sort of unbundling of infrastructure from governance, and how this, amplifies network effects. And what do you see as the main sort of governance changes between Web2 and Web3?
Yeah, the main governance changes again come back to how we are managing the governance over here. Because if governance becomes too centralized and if returns accrue too much in the favor of initial participants, adoption of the token and even scaling up the ecosystem start breaking down. So the key governance change over here is to ensure that you your governance is moving in sync with venture building or with component or infrastructure building around the protocol, and with the incentives for production in the ecosystem. And what this essentially means is that the initial governance itself is designed in such a way that the stakeholders who are governing the ecosystem, they have incentives to participate in the governance. They don't just hold on to the token in for speculation. At the same time, they have incentives not just to participate and use the token towards actual governance, but to also ensure that as greater venture building and greater production happens around the protocol, more of the governance also gets decentralized and more of the returns keep accruing across a larger part of the ecosystem. I think this is fundamentally different from how things worked in Web 2, because Web 2 was really more of, you know, putting all your bets on the winning horse, and the more the horse beat the other horses, the more returns accrue towards those who are funding it. It was not really accruing towards the other stakeholders in the ecosystem, because really the other stakeholders stayed on because there was a winning horse and there was a winner take all that was coming up, and so they had no other choice. They did not have perfect competition. They did not have other choice beyond a certain point. But in Web3, given, and again I always put this caveat over here, given correct and well-structured token design, we have the potential to get the entire ecosystem to move forward and to participate in governance and hence also participate in the accrual of returns as the ecosystem expands. So I think that's really powerful and fundamentally different from how things worked in a Web 2 model.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if we look at, for example, funding, when sort of funding protocols and infrastructure in Web3, well, in a Web2 situation, an organization would raise funds from VCs to subsidize ecosystem adoption. And this inevitably means that the value then flows back to VCs. Whereas with Web3, the crowdfunding model, yet whilst it very often includes VCs, it also includes, sort of the community and crowdfunding. And so could you sort of expand on that?
Yeah, there is a significant role for VCs to play over here because yes, there is we kind of start solving the cold start problem with the token, but the token itself has a cold start problem as well. Initially, without anything being built around the protocol, the token has no value, and without the token having value, nobody wants to build around the protocol. So you do need a bit of solutioning to that cold start with venture funding. But beyond that, what the token provides us is a well-designed token provides us a good set of incentives to incentivize the overall set of participants in this sort of open source ecosystem that we end up building. Because the challenge with traditional open source for a long time was that the costs of coordinating efforts was too high. And that was because a lot of the participation in open source was not driven by inorganic incentives. It was more driven by organic incentives. I won't necessarily call it altruism, but it was more driven by participation in the community and the benefits of that. Now, Web3 has all of that, but just having organic incentives of that form create coordination issues. You can't move people in a certain direction, and that is why in general in the Web2 era, even though back in 2006 or so we had really good open source, they were appropriated by Apple and Google and other companies towards closed business models because the coordination required that amount of funding, etc. And what Web3 does, it solves that coordination problem by combining inorganic incentives with the token, in addition to the organic incentives of just being part of the community. But if we've known anything from the evolution of technology and technological cycles, I would just say that even if the technology exists, you need to have the right incentives for participation. And altruism in itself is not a scalable nor a standardizable incentive towards coordination. And so that is why what the token does is it solves all of those coordination costs by creating the right incentives for participation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk a little about our collaboration. So as I mentioned, we're combining Web2 platform theory with these new tools and very much developing a playbook, both for Boson and more broadly to share with Web3. Without giving away too much of our secret sauce, what are some of the key strategic insights that we're developing?
There are quite a few things that we're looking at centered around one central framework, and that is what's getting decentralized, and hence how do you manage network effects in these new levers of decentralization. So as I mentioned, production, venture building / infrastructure, governance, funding. Only production was decentralized, and so we saw some network effects, which we've written a lot about, including the books that I've written. But what we're seeing now is a new form of network effect, which works across governance, across venture building, across funding, and gets coordinated through this token model. So what we're really looking at over here is how can you take the best learnings of what we've seen work in Web2 in just network effects of production, and apply that to really these network effects on steroids. If the right token model has been developed, how can these network effects be expanded across these additional three levers? And when we think of that, really what we're looking at is a whole set of new incentive mechanisms and tools that Web3 provides. How do you use that with the economic design and platform design principles of Web2 and kind of bring these two things together? So there's a lot of really good work that has happened in Web3 around token design and mechanism design. And there's a lot of good work in Web 2 around how market design works and how market incentives work. Bringing these two and creating a common playbook, that's really the gap that we're trying to fill. There's a lot of value that can be created by combining the best of Web 2 with the best that Web 3 has to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, it is fascinating to, have all these theoretical discussions. And, my background is, I studied a lot of this academically, and it's great to study the theory. But then, rolling our sleeves up and getting down to actually devising the battle plans, the go-to-market, etc., is where probably the most fascinating part of it.
Absolutely.
We are doing the classic strategy of a beachhead within Decentraland. We're also then looking to sort of syndicate across multiple virtual worlds. Again, that gives us that sort of almost like these network effects on the sort of metaverse side. At the same time, we've been massively assisted by the rise of metaverse going mainstream. And so, when we were developing things like Portal, it was okay, well, this is a bet that we're placing. We're hopefully, brands are going to be interested in selling physical products in the metaverse as NFTs. And as is so often the case with business, either you get zero or you get exponential, right? There's never this happy medium. And the demand has just gone exponential. And yeah, perhaps you could talk a little about how we're sort of developing and devising these battle plans.
Yeah, so this again goes back to the fact that we have to build these battle plans. It's not a one-dimensional battle plan. It's an n-dimensional battle plan, because you are incentivizing participation in the infrastructure creation, you're incentivizing participation in the governance, and you're incentivizing participation in the actual commerce. And then, of course, funding always kind of underpins all of this. But you need to ensure that there are no negative network effects across all of this. You don't want to be in a situation where there are governance actions that are being taken that lead to reduced venture building, or that leads to reduced usage of commerce. And this applies across all of these variables. So we need to look at all of these 6 different interactions and see and really plan out for potential negative network effects, mitigate those kinds of scenarios. We also need to ensure that the original theoretical construct of a token model does not create intra-ecosystem competition. How do we ensure that our battle plan at all times subscribes towards that? Because the moment we allow intra-ecosystem competition, the moment Boson or an entity within the Boson ecosystem is seen as anti-competitive with the others, that is where we then start seeing these kinds of negative network effects. So really, it's bringing a playbook of creating something that does not disincentivize participation within the ecosystem, does not create negative network effects, and applying that to these roadmaps and battle plans that we're designing.
Brilliant. Fascinating. I mean, and it's just such an absolute pleasure to, I guess, have the opportunity to be alive at this time, at the dawn of this new wave of web, to be working with you, Sangeet, solving these problems and applying them to decentralizing commerce, in order that this kind of the future for our sort of children and grandchildren is one that's sort of open and equitable, rather than this kind of closed extraction farm that we sort of find ourselves in now. So thank you very much, Sangeet, for attending today, and it's been fascinating sharing our work with everyone, and speak to you soon.
Thank you, Justin. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.